So we're still talking about the endocrine system here in an Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, Biology 160. In this section of the lecture, let's talk a little bit about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys. Let's pull up a picture that we were looking at before. See what these things look like. Here we go. So here's our kidneys sitting in our lower back there, just up underneath the ribs, and up on top of that kidney you'll have an adrenal gland. When you dissect a kidney in the lab this semester, you may have an adrenal gland on the top there, and it's just a little kind of a triangular shaped organ that sits this position right on top of those kidneys. So the adrenal gland has two types of tissue, tissues that came together to form this one gland. So we have an outer region which is called the adrenal cortex, and it is formed by glandular tissue. The inside is called the adrenal medulla, and it is formed by nervous tissue. So we have these two tissues that came together to form this one organ, this one endocrine organ, and it functions as an endocrine organ. The only other place we see this is in the pituitary gland. We have the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. If you remember when we talked about those, the posterior pituitary gland is an actual offshoot of the brain, so it is also neural tissue, whereas the anterior pituitary gland is glandular tissue, and so they're kind of stuck together in that area there. So the adrenal cortex, again, is the outer part of the adrenal gland, and it actually has three areas, and each of these three areas secretes some different hormones. First of all, we have the mineral corticoid secreting area, the glucocorticoid secreting area, and then also an area that secretes sex hormones. And we'll look at each of these in just a second here. And then in the inner part, we have the neural tissue on the inner part of the medulla, and it's going to be producing neurotransmitters, adrenaline and norepinephrine and epinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, depending on the words you want to use. Not acetylcholine, but the norepinephrine and epinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, is what's being produced there. Here in this picture here, we can see the adrenal gland, and here's the outer part here, and then we have the mineral corticoid secreting area on the outside, glucocorticoid secreting area, sex hormone, and then we have the adrenal medulla. And notice the different types of cells and tissues that are coming into play here. All of them are secreting these different hormones. You can see it sitting on top of the kidney here. So the mineral corticoids, these are, as they sound, their job is to maintain the mineral content of our body. And so what that means is we're looking at our electrolyte balance as well as the minerals that we have floating around in our blood. Because we are maintaining the electrolytes, and again, electrolytes are things like sodium, potassium, chloride, those sorts of things, those ions that are important in our body. These we call electrolytes. Because it is affecting the electrolytes, that in turn is going to affect the water content as well. So water, through osmosis, is going to follow the electrolytes. So if we're pulling electrolytes, keeping them in the body, water is also going to stay in the body. If we're getting rid of those electrolytes, the water is going to go as well. And so this also is going to affect things like blood pressure and blood volume and things like that. And so because it's going to affect electrolyte and mineral content, its target organ is the kidney. The kidney's job is to, we'll look at this later in the urinary system, but the kidney's job is to maintain our electrolyte balance. We often think of it as getting rid of waste, which is important, but even more important than that is maintaining the electrolyte balance in our body. And So there's a couple hormones here that are going to affect the adrenal cortex, and in turn are going to cause it to start producing the hormones that it produces, the mineral corticoids. So you have something called renin and also aldosterone. Renin is produced by the kidneys when blood pressure drops, and when that renin is released, that's going to trigger the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and that's going to reverse it's going to pull these it's going to pull minerals from the kidney, keep them from being let out, and that's going to increase the blood pressure. Then there's also our atrial natriuretic peptide, which is another hormone that's produced by the heart, that is going to cause a reduction of blood pressure. Here's a flow chart showing all the things that go into directing the flow of aldosterone from the adrenal gland. Some of these we've already seen, some we've talked a little bit about. So here's the pituitary gland up here. Before we talked about ACTH. And when it's released from the anterior pituitary gland, what it does is it stimulates the release of the hormones in the adrenal cortex. We just talked about the kidney, and it releases renin, which goes on to stimulate this hormone called angiotensin II, which then stimulates the secretion of aldosterone. Also, we have a direct stimulation in the blood. If the electrolytes in the blood increase or decrease depending on the electrolyte, that can also stimulate the adrenal gland. And then we have the inhibitory hormone released by the heart, ANP, which tells it to shut off the aldosterone, which is going to let the blood pressure fall back down. So all these things there's a lot of mechanisms here affecting the adrenal gland and what it's releasing. Next we have the glucocorticoids, which are released from that second layer in the adrenal cortex. And the main glucocorticoids are cortisone and cortisol. You've probably heard of these before. You've maybe heard of cortisone cream. These are steroid hormones, and they are often known as the stress hormones. So when you're under a lot of stress, they are released in abundance in order to help you deal with that stress. And so these are good hormones to have, but if the stress lasts for too long, they can have some negative effects, as we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So the middle layer here, so we have it's also promoting normal cell metabolism, and it's going to be released in response to increased blood levels of ACE. So we come in contact with a lot of stress. Some stressors are very short term, some will last a lot longer. Depending on the stressor, there's some different pathways that our body can use to help us deal with the stress and overcome that stress. When we talked about the nervous system, we talked about the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. We talked about the flight or fight versus rest and digest system. If we have a stressor that comes in, we come in contact with, we're going to activate the flight or fight reflex to help us deal with that stress. So this is going to happen through the nervous system, and so we're going to send a signal through our nervous system. It's going to go to the adrenal medulla. Notice now this is the adrenal medulla, which is the nervous tissue on the inside of the adrenal gland. So adrenal medulla, and it is stimulated by nervous impulse, not by hormones flowing in the blood, not by humoral or hormonal control, but this is an example of the nervous system control. So we have these nerves coming into the adrenal medulla, and they're going to trigger the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these are going to go into our bloodstream, and these are going to help us fight with the stress, and we get the things we think about when we're under stress: increase our heart rate, increase our blood pressure, We're going to release glucose in the blood so that our cells have that energy close at hand, so we can grab that, burn that, and produce ATP. Dilate the bronchioles. We're gonna focus our blood flow into the brain and to the others. We're gonna divert it from the digestive system because we don't need it at that time, and increase the metabolic rate. All these things happen in order to help us deal with that stress. If it's a long-term stress, however, we're going to take a different pathway here. This is going to come through the anterior pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary gland is going to release ACTH, which is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, the outside of the adrenal gland. Then it's going to release the mineral corticoids that we talked about, and that's going to affect the mineral content and also the electrolyte content of our body, and that's going to increase blood volume and pressure. But at the same time, it's also going to stimulate the release of the glucocorticoids, and they have some interesting effects here where they also convert proteins and fats to glucose to use for energy, and they increase the blood sugar. They also suppress the immune system. And so for a stressor, these are good things to happen, but if this lasts for too long, this is going to lead to some problems. Notice that the immune system, so people that are stressed out, have a high level of stress that lasts for an extended period of time, they're more likely to get sick, and the reason is because of this immune system that's being suppressed, and the body's not able to fight the diseases, the pathogens that are trying to get into their body. The last hormones that are released from the adrenal cortex are the sex hormones. This is the inner layer of the adrenal cortex, and mainly it's going to be releasing what we call androgens, which are the male sex hormones, but also some estrogen. The sex hormones are also released from the testes and the ovaries as well. We'll see here in a minute, but the adrenal cortex does also produce at least small amounts of these hormones throughout our life as well. All right, so those are the hormones that are released by the adrenal cortex, and then also the adrenal medulla, the epinephrine and norepinephrine that we saw. So let's take the last couple minutes here and talk about things that can go wrong. So adrenal glands, so these hormones are very important. So if you have too many or too few, that's going to cause a lot of problems. For example, we have something called Addison's disease, and this is when you have hyposecretion of the adrenal cortex hormones. And what's going to happen? You're going to get some bronze skin. So in this case, you're going to be losing electrolytes. Your body's not going to hold those electrolytes. You have this bronze skin tone. Muscles are weak. Susceptibility to infection. It's not going to result in it's going to have some bad effects. And then we have something called hyperaldosteronism, and this is when we're producing too much aldosterone, and this may be caused by a tumor that's in the pituitary gland releasing a lot of ACTH, and so it's stimulating the release of the aldosterone a lot. And this is when you are holding in too much sodium, holding in too many electrolytes, and so the water is also getting held in. You're going to have high blood pressure, swelling, and things like that. We also have something called Cushing's syndrome or Cushing's disease. And this is when you are producing too much of the cortisone or cortisol hormones. And so it's like you're always stressed out. Not necessarily that you're always stressed out, but you're getting the effects of if you were always stressed out. And so these people here, they start to gain weight, but they gain it in interesting places. And they get one of the places is they start to lay down fat around the face, so you get this kind of round-shaped face, the moon face. And then fat also gets laid down on their back, and so you get this kind of hump. And then also you'll often get this tire around the middle. But at the same time, things like your legs will be really skinny, and your arms will be really skinny. So it looks disproportional. So it's not this is different than normal obesity. This is you're getting fat in some interesting looking places. Also lead to high blood pressure, hyperglycemia. So if you're releasing a lot of cortisol and cortisone into the body, you're gonna remember one of the things they do is they stimulate the release of glucose, and so you're going to have lots of glucose running around in your blood, and you can even become diabetic, protein diabetic they call it, And then also you have weakening of bones, depression. So a lot of things go in here. A lot of things are happening if you have this. You're producing too much of these hormones, the glucocorticoids. Then finally, masculinization. So if you're producing too many of the androgens, doesn't matter if you're male or female, you're going to start to get male characteristics. And for a female, this means that you may get a beard, have hair growing in places that males would have, because you're getting these hormones that you're not supposed to be having necessarily. All right, that's the adrenal gland.